Welcome back to our podcast. Hey everyone, it's Mark and Sophia. We are running through the world of possibilities when it comes to training volunteers today. So we're going to talk about the pros and cons of different types of training, how you can approach it, scheduling, all that fun stuff, because a well-trained volunteer makes for a good volunteer experience. So let's get started. Do you want to go through the types first? There's like 3 major types.
Yeah, actually, before that, I just want to say, I want to actually start out with why is training important? And sometimes there's a pitfall with training. And so it just sort of popped into my mind, so I'll just put it out there. A lot of the times, the things that we all become experts in, we don't realize that other people don't know. So one of the skills that we have to develop in volunteer coordination and building really good volunteer programs is recognizing the stuff that is learned and the things that are intuitive. And sometimes it's really hard to figure that out. Like if you're running a food bank, right? And you're bringing somebody in and they're packaging up like pre-packaged bags of food items for people for delivery. You might go to the volunteer and literally go over to them and go over there and just take one of each and put it in the bag. And the volunteer's like, what? You know? And they're like, well, what is a prepackaged thing? What do you mean one of each what? Like, where is it? Like, what's the process? So sometimes it is a real skill to be able to say, I need to separate myself from the things I've learned and know and put myself in the mind of a volunteer who knows nothing. And we should always be talking to even the volunteers that know something and even know a lot. We should be revisiting certain concepts with them because as a professional, you watching this podcast episode, there are lots of things you're going to take for granted about what you already know. So that's just my 2 cents on training on why it's so important and so critical and why we can sort of miss out on it. And the other part of it is that when we are able to convey really well what the volunteer needs to be able to do, how they need to be really good at doing this thing, they become less nervous, less anxious, they become more excited, they feel better equipped. And even when they're done, if they had done an equally good job, when they're well trained doing it, they go into it with a mindset of confidence. And so when they're done with it, like I said, even if they did equally as good a job, they know they did a good job because they were trained on how to do it. They know you set up what the expectations were about what they needed to do and how they needed to do it. And they felt confident that they were able to do those things. So all of those things are really, really vital to a really good volunteer experience. All right, I just wanted to get that out.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that.
We can take for granted the things we become experts in. Now I'll tell a goofy story, but my wife and I always use this as an example. Years ago, we lived in a town in Connecticut called Milford, and they had a transfer station where you would go and you would put your garbage. And we would go to this transfer station maybe 4 times a year because we had garbage pickup, but every once in a while we'd have some weird stuff that we needed to bring down there. And we would always be nervous to go to this transfer station because the people there would yell at you about everything. And so you'd show up and you'd be like, I have an old dishwasher. And you'd walk up and you'd be like, where do I put this? And they'd be like, over near the metal stuff, around the corner and, past the tree. And so you're like, you go over there and there's like nothing there. You don't know if this is the right spot. And you're like, I guess this is the right spot. And then you'd put it down and then the people would start yelling at you because you didn't know where the dishwashers went. And my wife would be like completely freaked out about bringing like things to this place. And so the people that work there, they're there every day. They know where everything's supposed to be. And so to them, giving you what they think is a very basic instruction is actually not all that obvious to the person they're talking to. They're not there every day. They don't know. So that's just my quirky little story. So,
well, I want to tell my story now. So
yeah, let's hear it.
With karate, I'm a big martial artist. Actually, we both are. And whenever you go over the basics in a class, a lot of times as a newer teacher, you're all freaked out that the more senior students are redoing the basics. But in reality, like as a senior student, you appreciate that because you get to refine your skills. So let's say you have a recurring training for volunteers. Like I'm sure that the longtime volunteers would love to go through it again and it builds their confidence, like you said.
And they might pick up on little things that they've missed through the years, right? And they're like, oh yeah, that's a good reminder. We have to do that again. Yeah, cool.
We love training.
Yeah, we're big into training. All right, so you started out with the types, which I think is brilliant. Let's talk about that. So you lead us into that.
So we typically see 3 main types of training. One is virtual training. The next is in-person training. And then the last is training through a third party.
Which may be virtual and may be in person. We kind of, yeah. So virtual obviously became much, much bigger once COVID hit. We had a lot of people, actually, we had a big year, the year of COVID, believe it or not. And one of the main reasons why, or coming out of COVID or in response to COVID, and one of the reasons why was that people wanted to start converting their trainings to be virtual because they could no longer hold them with groups of people. Kind of interesting. We were not anticipating that. But to be able to move things online, it also just opened people's eyes to what you could do virtually. Like our whole world is on Zoom today when it wasn't as much back then. People forget what it was like in 2019. But doing virtual trainings are actually really super effective, especially at delivering tactical information, like purely information-based training components. Like, what do I need to know? Where do I need to go? What do I need to do? That sort of really tactical part of it. And if it's done well, you could also have connection in virtual training. So I hope, just as you're sitting and listening to this podcast, you're getting kind of a feel for Sophia and I, our personalities, our sense of humor, right? So some of these things can be conveyed even in a virtual setting, so people feel at ease with the organization. So there is a bit of virtual bonding. So if you're not a customer already, when you are a customer, you'll see that like I do like a lot of the training videos, and during the sales process, we're recording things and sending them around. And I have people all the time walking up to me at conferences going, I feel like I know you already. And I've never met them, right? But we're kind of building this relationship. So that's a cool part about virtual. The other big thing about virtual is that you don't need to schedule it according to some preset schedule. So if I'm the person leading a training, I can do the training one time, and then people can watch that training whenever they want. And it doesn't mean that they can't ask questions either. Like you can actually have training tools where people can pop a question into the training tool. Sometimes there's some of them have AI where they might be able to answer the question. Some of them, it'll pop a question in and it'll shoot an email to whoever the administrator is for that online course, then they can respond to them. So there's lots of opportunity there to even have two-way connection and communication. But the big thing is, your volunteer can decide to take that course in their pajamas at 11 o'clock at night if they wanted to, right? On the train on the way into work. So they're not tied to a specific time or place, and your staff isn't tied to it either. And so rather than saying, well, I'm going to do this training 100 times for 100 volunteers, I can do it the one time, and those 100 different volunteers can go through that course. So that's a huge benefit to virtual. Any thoughts?
I guess that is a newer thing, virtual training. Relatively new.
Relatively, yeah.
Yeah. I guess cons. I could think of some reasons that maybe you wouldn't want to do virtual. I know like a big thing is you want to make sure that people are paying attention to the training, and it's a little bit harder. Like they could play it and walk away, but again, there are things that you can do to ensure that they understood the material, like put in a quiz at the end of the virtual training and make sure they have to get a certain score to pass. But
yeah, you can also have in some of the learning management systems, like if you use a learning management system for it, they can actually measure engagement, like how engaged the person was, if they had tabs open over the thing while they were listening to it. But you're right, having in person, like that they're standing there making or sitting there making eye contact with you for sure. I can think of another con of virtual is that you can't physically hand something to someone or walk them into a room or train them on how to lift something, and actually witness them lifting it and maybe adjusting their posture or, so there's sometimes, or giving somebody a tour of a facility, like I need to actually show you around. So there are some training elements where it just can't be replicated virtually. We have some customers that work with, I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast episode, but where you're like working with animals and they actually, as a part of the training, they'll hand you like a bear cub, so cute. Yeah, can't do that virtually, right? So no. You can do a course on like how to properly hold an animal or what the do's and don'ts of handling any material or being, but actually doing it is another thing. So in those cases, you could still supplement or augment training. So sometimes we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because if I said, oh, well, we do all of our trainings in person because you have to hold the bear cup. I'm going to keep with this analogy because it's fun. But that it's actually not true. You probably can do 90% of the training other than bear cup holding. And now what you're doing is you're getting a group of people together to hold the bear cups, right? So, and in that circumstance, you get the best of both worlds. You get to get all of the easy stuff that you can convey virtually that they can do on their own time whenever they want. And so it requires less time, and you get to focus on the things that are actually needed to do in person. So you might break them up into, 2 different requirements and have them do one portion of it virtually, the other portion in person. So, but definitely having to be physically present to see, touch, walk through, experience something is a downside to virtual and a plus side to in person. Any other downsides you can think of with virtual, Sophia?
Virtual. I mean, sometimes it's nice to meet other people through a training, but kind of realize that you're both starting at the same time. You could bond over that with other volunteers, but if you're on like a live virtual training, you get the same experience.
Well, we get this a lot too, because a part of the reason why people volunteer with organizations is community. So sometimes we go, well, part of what the volunteers come and they get to know each other. The new volunteers get to know each other, and they get to know the organization through the person presenting. And so believe me, I think that is fantastic. And a big part of why we volunteer is community. Like, we get together with a bunch of people that feel passionate about the same causes that we feel passionate about. It's a fantastic way to meet new friends and community members, and to bond over things. But again, that doesn't have to be over training. So,
yeah.
We don't have to sit in a room and take a sexual harassment training together in order to form a bond. So I like to separate those things. Like, wouldn't you rather, right? If like an organization says, well, we do in-person trainings to do our, our introduction to the organization or whatever it is. Wouldn't you rather host a monthly volunteer get-together and social time instead of that? In this way, when we do get together, it's 100% about community and connection, and the training stuff is already taken care of. And even if you wanted to do a little like introductory, hey, just wanted to reinforce these concepts that you learned in your online training, but what this is really about today is getting to know you, is actually way better. So don't abandon that. The aspects that the volunteer training can provide to give a sense of community and connection, don't abandon that. Just transfer it to something else that's actually even cooler and more fun.
You sold me. Yeah, that is more fun. I don't want to bond during training necessarily, but doing something more fun.
So that we've been talking about in-person training a lot. So we sort of already revealed what the pros and cons are to that. You're in person, it's much easier to bond and connect and get a feeling for the organization and other volunteers. You could do things that are hands-on, where you actually need to be walked around, tour a facility, learn how to lock and unlock doors, what shelves you shouldn't go up on, what shelves are the ones where the things are you need to go to. But then the downsides of in-person are that somebody needs to be there to lead the training. The volunteer has to schedule time out of their lives to show up in person to go do this, which is increasingly difficult. So one of the reasons why in-person volunteering is down as far as hours. So quickly, I'll delve into this. Let's say 30 years ago, there were a fewer percentage of people volunteering, but a higher rate of volunteering as far as hours go. And what that basically means is a smaller percentage of people were volunteering, but they were volunteering a lot more than they do today. So why this has really changed is because of the ages at which people volunteer, the lengths at which people are working, like people are working well into retirement nowadays. The fact that we have dual income families where both adults are working, and we have an increase in single parent households where the person who is working is also doing everything else. So time is at a premium. The blessing of the millennial and Gen Z and hopefully Gen Alpha generations are that they actually volunteer at a higher rate, like a higher percentage of those generations are volunteering, but they just do it in smaller bites. So, I might have joined, in the 1950s, I might have joined a local community center or club and been volunteering there 20, 30 hours a week. Whereas today it's not practical, like it has to fit into our life. So we might be volunteering 2 or 3 hours a month, but more of us are doing that. So why did I even say that? Oh, so getting everybody together all at one time to coordinate an in-person training is more difficult than it has ever been. To be able to say, have you ever tried to just get together like group of 5 friends?
So hard.
Right? So everybody's got a million things going. If you are children or you have grandchildren and you're caring for your grandchildren, or you work full time and both of you work full time, or one of you works full time and you have full custody of all of your kids, saying, between all of these things that we all have going on in our lives, it's really difficult to get everybody to agree on a single time. So that's the major downside, in my opinion, is that it's a massive inconvenience, and it makes it less likely that your volunteers will be able to go to the training, which makes it less likely they'll be able to volunteer. And then on top of that, your staff, who is already probably overwhelmed with 1,000,001 different things and wearing 5 or 6 different hats, also has to take time out of their day to do this training. So that's where I said, well, we could separate the training aspect to the community building, put those 2 things together, and you've got the best of both worlds. Plus, it's a heck of a lot more fun. And then the third thing you mentioned was third party. So this is really kind of an offshoot of both virtual and in person, right? So you could put a little sub item under each of those. It's like, is this being delivered by you, or is this being delivered by a third party? And so that's something else that we need to consider, because if it's an in-person training delivered by someone else, or it's a virtual training where you have to go to someone else's site or system in order to take that training, then the increased complexity with that type is the reconciliation of who actually did it and who didn't. So if somebody does a virtual training with your organization, there's usually going to be a record that they attended the virtual training, and you can say, okay, did they do it or not? If it's an in-person training and you have that training, you have a list of people. You looked at them eye to eye. You check people off of a list. If this is being done by a third party, the complexity that's introduced with that, whether it's virtual or in person, is that now I have to check with that third party as to whether or not they did it or not. And how they provide that information to you can be kind of clumsy sometimes. So that's the introduce, something as simple as, we have some customers where they have to go to the state's website to complete a training process. Like it's in law that they have to take this specific course that's on the state's website. Well, the state's website doesn't give a login to the organization to say who did it or who didn't. There's no email notification saying that this volunteer completed the training or not. So you either have to rely on the volunteer coming back to you and saying, did it, or they have to be issued some sort of certificate, and then they have to provide you the certificate. You have to validate that it's the right certificate and then mark off that they did it. So it's just something to consider when you're talking about virtual versus in-person, and whether or not that's done by a third party or you're doing it in-house.
Right.
I think we nailed the 3 types.
Did we miss any types?
I don't think so. Virtual, in-person, and then third party.
Fantastic. So, scheduling training. There are different ways to go about this. It kind of depends on which type you go with too. So these things all overlap.
It does. Actually, even like in virtual, some of the ways in which some of our customers do it is they do a live webinar. And so the scheduling aspect to it is, it really is separate. So is it a group training? Is it one-on-one? Is it on demand? I mean, they can do it anytime they want to. Is there a preset schedule where we do this on every Monday and Wednesday, or on the first Tuesday of every month? Or is it something where we can say, no, there's a custom schedule? Like, you're actually going to schedule the training with somebody. This is most common, obviously, in one-on-one training. So let's dive into, and then on top of that, no, we already did this, group versus one-on-one. Okay, so let's start off toward the end. And part of this is that sometimes we get stuck into delivering something in a way that we just always have done it. And just revealing, no, there's lots of different ways you can schedule. There's lots of different ways you can deliver the training. And then you might be able to revisit what you're doing today and say, ooh, I actually really like that one. It has the same benefits with less overhead. right? It's more efficient, but it hits on all the major bullet items that we need to. So that's why it's good to talk through these things. So that's the other bit of advice I'll give you. Don't get too locked into this is how we do it. We've always done it that way. Just free your mind for a second and say, could we do this another way? Because there's going to be a benefit to me and there's going to be a benefit to the volunteer. So we said, does this need to be one-on-one? Most trainings do not need to be one-on-one, unless it's for like super highly skilled things like volunteering in a hospital setting and you need to be highly focused on an individual to make sure that they're getting all of the information you're feeding to them. But most trainings do not need to be one-on-one. So usually one-on-one trainings are the things saying, well, there's going to be some sort of custom schedule if it needs to be one-on-one. That means that the person receiving and the person training, they need to negotiate together to figure out what time the two of them can meet with each other. Once you move to a more group experience, you can start doing things like a preset schedule. Like if you did want to deliver it live, like there is another perfectly valid reason why we might want to do a virtual training, but it's delivered live. And I neglected to mention this in the previous segment, but it doesn't need to be recorded. It could be a live webinar. And now we get the benefit of all of those things we were talking about before with interacting, asking questions, and you might even be able to see everybody's pictures and stuff and the people who are participating in that training. So once you move to a group setting, you can do it preset. You can say, listen, we hold this thing once a month. We hold this training once a week. And that means that there's no negotiating, the part of negotiating the time or place, that goes away as a problem, as a barrier. We talk about these things in terms of this being a barrier to engagement. And we want to eliminate barriers to engagement. So setting a custom schedule is a pretty big barrier, right? So if you can do it where it's preset, where it's known to everybody in advance and people can pick when they can make that time, that's the next step better, right? On both ends. Overall, sometimes one-on-one's better for the volunteer because I get my own time, but overall, I think the preset schedule is better. But the bigger thing, and this is the best one in my opinion, if you can get there, is a group setting, right? But it's on demand. So and when I say group, I mean you can have the same approach for all people, so that you can just issue this out to all of your volunteers and say, you can just start this training whenever you want. So I
that
guess
would be like a course online that they would do, or a video they watch.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Yep.
Like a module.
So I guess you really could look at that. That's a one-on-one, but on demand. So I guess virtual does open up for one-on-one too. So, and the other thing with groups is training groups at a time. Obviously, the one-to-many ratio is huge. If I'm one person and I can train 50 people at the same time, it's a heck of a lot better than me having training each of them 50 times. If I can train them, or I can train 50 people all on one session, then I only have to invest 1 hour. If I can train, an unlimited number of people with one recorded training seminar, then that's the best case scenario from a staffing perspective. So I always try to start with that and work backward. Like, why wouldn't that work? So let's put together our training in a way where we can put something online that's good, engaging, we're able to have some sort of connection, but also delivering all of the relative information. And I just record this training once or once a year. I might revisit it. And now I have an infinite number of people that can do it, and they can schedule it whenever they want on demand. If we start coming up with valid reasons, they have to be valid, then you can start saying, maybe we do need to move to a preset. There's too much Q&A back and forth. There are some trainings where people just have too many questions. And in order to get the training across, you really need the Q&A, which, by the way, if you can always migrate from one of these to the next. And if I start out doing, like even for me, I will do a training live first. I do live trainings, and then people start asking me questions, and what I start learning what visual cues and responses I'm getting back from people to be able to know what's resonating, what's not resonating, so I know how to actually build the virtual training. And then I might move to scheduled webinar-based trainings, so that I can continue to hone and refine this. I can almost anticipate what questions people are going to ask. They always ask, they always fall into these categories. And then I can ultimately get to the point where I go, okay, now I'm just making it a course, because I've trained 100 people through this now, and I've got all of this experience as to what I can anticipate and to know that this is going to be a very high quality training. And if you're using somebody else's training course, they should have done this for you. So this is how you know, okay, this is a great course because it's answering all of the questions in advance for them. So it's also okay to adopt one and then move to the other ones to march toward an ideal.
That's a really good point, because let's say you want ultimately to have a course because you're like, that's easiest, they can take it whenever, but you don't yet have the experience. It's hard to build a course. So like all these things really do stack on top of each other by the end.
Yeah, and sometimes
making all your own courses.
Sometimes we do things manually because we don't know what we're doing, and that's okay too. Like I've done many webinars on topics before where I'm like, I need to do this in like a focus group kind of thing, because I don't know what people want from me in this session before I can get up and it's very difficult to deliver a seminar on something without anybody in front of you asking you a question. It's actually much easier to have a dialogue. I can draw on my experience, they can draw on their experience, but if I want to keep people active and engaged in a topic when it's just me and a blank audience out there, you better be really good at delivering that and have had a lot of experience in the back and forth leading up to it. So, all right.
Fun.
So we should probably close this one talking about what? Talking about the process. Yeah. How do we track this stuff? So we have touched on this. So, and we've talked about this in other podcasts. We need to provide notice to the volunteer that this training needs to be done. So one of the things is just like, hey, listen, if you want to volunteer in the, holding bear cubs, if you want to volunteer in this hospital unit, if you want to volunteer for the food bank, picking up boxes and delivering food to people, there is training involved with this that you have to go through before you can be eligible to do that. And so there is this notice and an acceptance of that. And so the volunteer is saying, yes, I will do the training. So notice and acceptance.
Something with the notice that I think is important is having like, how much time? Is this going to be an 8-hour training? Is this going to be a 20-minute training?
Yeah,
I find that to be helpful in completion on the volunteer side.
Setting expectations. It's much easier to meet expectations if you set them. So having somebody go blind into something, and they're, even when you design an online course, it needs to clearly communicate how many modules are there, how much time should this be taking me. So like there's a couple of trainings that a lot of our customers use, and we always say from the beginning, let them know it's online, they can do it whenever they want, and it takes 25 minutes. Like most important elements. And people go, okay, I know what I need to set. I can do that right now. I've got 25 minutes right now. So
yeah,
very good point. Then the second part of that is after they've actually done it, right? What's the second part? Do I have that right?
Yeah, they do it. The second part is they actually do it. They show up, they take the module,
So how do we know that they did it? And we have to go back to those different methods again. If they're in person, pretty easy. They walked in the door, I took attendance. If they did a virtual training, whether it be via a webinar or an online course, then we typically will have systems that will report back to us who showed up, who logged in. And then if it is handled by a third party, then we have to somehow get that from them. And sometimes it is the third party that's giving you that information. And sometimes there's some trigger or mechanism the volunteer can have to demonstrate or prove that they did that. And it's either that they swear they did, right, which might be okay for you, or it's that they actually got issued a certificate, or there was some email confirmation they got when they completed it that they can forward on to you. So they got notice, they promised they were going to do it, they actually did it, and we have some evidence that they did it, especially if it's a legal requirement. We do have some customers where there's a training and it's just to make the volunteer more well-rounded. And we're like, yeah, go do the training. Let us know when it's done. Good? Like we have some people who just embed a YouTube video and go, watch this video, check this box saying you did it. And that may be perfect. And we're all for low barriers, right? So if that's perfect in that situation, great. If you have a legal compliance issue where somebody needs to be trained in this, otherwise you can get sued or lose your medical license or something else, then we need to have better audit trails and better systems to actually demonstrate that they completed a course, they did attend, there's an attendance sheet, there was a certificate issued, there was an online course, we have an audit trail that they completed it. All right.
Those are the three main steps in tracking it. I mean, then obviously making it having good systems to track that they completed it, so they're ready to start volunteering, communicating to the volunteer that they can come in and start. But then as they go, these trainings might need to be repeated. So when does it have to be repeated? Is it every year? Every 2 years?
This is when good systems really come into place. So, and also a good centralized systems. I might have a third-party system, like I sent them off to the state's website to do the training. You're like, well, they have a record that they did it. Like, but I don't have access to their records. So what evidence, what proof do I have? Because especially if it's for a legal reason, or even from a liability or risk standpoint that we need to have this. So it's not necessarily like a criminal thing, but it might be a liability thing. So we have to have good systems that not only have record of when they completed it, but evidence that they completed it. And we want to also track whether or not that needs to be repeated over time. And if it did, when they did it, with more evidence that they did it again. So, I always feel like that I'm plugging our system shamelessly, and I'm not embarrassed to do that at all.
Maybe you are doing
because we've learned this through a lot of bumps in the road. Like I've had so many conversations through the years with lawyers, with insurance providers, like insurance adjusters that will come back and they'll say, oh, thank God our customer has this system. Because if there is an incident and we have to go back a year or two, it's so easy to recall this information that normally people are digging through file cabinets or they have got a spreadsheet that says they did something with no evidence. So, a spreadsheet, anybody can put something into a spreadsheet. Whereas if you say, no, I have a copy of the certificate. I have actually an electronic issuance of the fact that they completed this course. I have an audit trail of when they agreed to take the course, when they passed the course, what the date timestamp was, when it expired, when they had to repeat it. Like having systems that track the audit trail of these compliance requirements, the evidence is the biggest thing. So if you just have a record in a spreadsheet, or sometimes we have customers, which is better than nothing, by the way. We have some customers that actually have a checklist that a program coordinator needs to check off and then sign. And they say, yes, I did these things. I gave them this training, and yes, they did it. Better than nothing. Right, but what is even better than that is an electronic transaction of it with, evidence that can be stored forever, paper that isn't lost, all that sort of stuff. So, but the important elements are that you actually have a record of what the requirement was, specifically what they completed, when they completed it, if there was an expiration, when it expired, if they had to repeat it, when they repeated it, and actual evidence of the course completion is also crucial. It's much better than just saying, yes, we have a record that they completed on this date. If we actually have evidence that they completed it, like a certificate or an electronic course completion, even better if you're using like an LMS or something like that.
That centralized database is super important too when you're thinking about recruiting for jobs that you have, because if you have like 20, well, that's 20 spots, but you might have 20 different trainings for your volunteer program, and if you're trying to recruit for, what did you say, the bear?
Yeah.
What was the animal you said? Holding bear cubs. Yeah, you want to pull the people who are either going through the process of, or said they would want it, they're interested in that, or that they're already trained in that area. If you're trying to fill something quickly, like, hey, we need help over here on this day, instead of just sending it out to everyone and then you're bugging everyone all the time. So it's nice to have that information on all your volunteers.
Yeah. So, and by the way, that whole holding bear cubs things is actually a real example from an animal sanctuary that is a customer of ours. So, I think actually staff are the only ones allowed to hold bear cubs, though. I think I'm remembering that correctly. But there were other ones like that. Bear cubs in particular, they don't let the volunteers handle. But, all right, I think we're good on volunteer training. There. By the way, I'll leave this little teaser for a future podcast. There is a difference between orientation and training. So and that's there are distinctions there and important things. And so Sophia and I have talked about it and said, well, what's the difference, and like what goes into a good training versus orientation. So we'll talk about that in a future episode. I'll leave that little teaser out there.
I love it. See you all soon.
Yeah, awesome. Bye, everybody.